My educational background began in Kenya, where I went to high school initially, and then because it was a difficult time for Asians in Africa, in 1971 I finished my high schooling in England, and that was in a high school in Oxford, and that was very formative for my career. For one thing, when I went from Kenya, where I had wonderful food, I went to England, where the food was remarkably awful, and I stopped eating in that year. And so it was as though in some ways I moved forward, in some ways I moved backwards. And from school in England, high school in England, I went to medical school in England. And at my medical school in the University of London, at my final exams, my examiner, who was a very tough woman, we had oral exams in England, one of the toughest women who built the field of medicine. I work in hepatology, liver diseases, and gastroenterology. Her name was Professor Dame Sheila Sherlock, examined me. And she was very tough. And at the end of my examination, she offered me a job. And that was the prime job in London, which has 12 medical schools. It did in those days. So it was very hard to turn that job down. And I worked for her, and it was probably the toughest job of my life. But at the end of that job, she used to lay bets with me and on patients and the diagnosis. And I worked so hard that I won my bets. Anyhow, so at the end of that job, my husband wanted to come to the United States. So I told him I'd like to move to the United States. And she said to me, "Whatever for?" And so I explained to her that he wanted to do research at the NIH. And so she wrote letters. And after that, to be honest, I never applied for a single job. Her letters carried me so far. She became a fellow of the Royal Society. Very few clinicians are fellows of the Royal Society. You have to be Newton or Darwin to be a fellow of the Royal Society. And here was Professor Dame Sheila Sherlock, a fellow of the Royal Society, and I worked for her. So, you know, in many ways, in clinical gastroenterology and hepatology, you sort of, people know you through that. And from there I went to, the nearest thing to my husband where I went to was Mount Sinai, New York, where I did my residency in medicine. And then from there I went to Hopkins, which was the nearest to the NIH, and I did my fellowship in gastroenterology, and I stayed on as faculty there. And that's where I worked in another very famous person's lab. His name was John Gearhart. He's a pioneer in stem cell biology, as we know it, and he was one of the first people who cultured human stem cells. And I worked in his lab while I was a fellow, a clinical fellow, who'd never done any research in my life. And he was very worried about having someone like me. And it was, the program took off because nobody had looked at liver and gut stem cells in those days in 1987. So they offered me a position on faculty, and I stayed on. And then when the commute became too long, I moved to Washington, and I worked in Washington, D.C.